Officer down! I repeat, officer down!
Welcome back to 1033. This is your host, Nathan Kapler, a podcast created for a first responder by a first responder. If you are not a first responder, you still are welcome. This podcast is aimed directly at trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD is complex and often misunderstood. Our brave men and women who serve our communities often end up with behavioral and psychological issues as a result of experienced trauma from their careers. My goal is to share what I know, my personal experience with PTSD as a retired police officer, and continue to advocate for mental health while providing support to those still in their careers. This podcast is not a substitute for professional medical help, and I strongly suggest if you are in fact suffering, you seek out professional medical advice. Please join me on this episode as I continue to expose the reality of PTSD challenges. I hope you enjoy this week's episode. Last week we left off with my experience into harassment and bullying and what that looked like. I specifically recalled details of the individual and what his actions were towards me. Not to air dirty laundry and point blame at the RCMP for the problem that existed with this supervisor, but to show you how real harassment and bullying is. The next part of my journey is the impact to me, what that looks like. If I were to use the analogy of the frog in the pot of boiling water, the water was now boiling for me. I no longer felt safe to walk into work, into a police building. I held fear that something further was going to happen. My anxiety had kicked into overdrive in a bid to help me recognize that I didn't even feel safe in that environment. And as my story progressed from the beginning of first being involved with this individual all the way up until that event where he charged me in the hallway, my anxiety was creating this level, this increasing level within that were giving me the gentle nudges that I knew I should pay attention to, but I refused to. Again, hopeful that some of these issues would just go away on their own. Or through the talking that I was now doing with this individual that something would get better. And when those conversations were not met with the expectation that I expected from this individual as a leader, my anxiety would continue to grow stronger and stronger. I wasn't honoring myself in those moments truly. I could have done so much along the way earlier in that process, and I should have. I should have stepped forward much earlier than the point where I talk about being charged by him, or even some of the warning signs that I saw within this individual, the alcoholism, the addiction, the declining performance. Prevention is a very big part of mental health. And when we don't take action, when we know we should be taking action on something, we give up a piece of ourselves. We do not honor ourselves. We allow boundaries to be crossed. The lines of respect become blurred. Our own self-worth and the narrative we accept or tell ourselves can shift. There is no shame in feeling these feelings in a journey of harassment and bullying if you are on the end as a victim. You should be stepping forward as soon as you can. I strongly recommend it and I strongly support it. Do not accept any other version of the truth than that. You are worth it. You need to protect yourself in this profession. Your health depends on it. Now, as my anxiety began to grow, it actually then flipped into panic attacks. And the panic attacks now were starting. They were fairly minor, but I could definitely feel them. I was in a constant state of fight or flight, even at home now. I was on edge 24/7. I wasn't sleeping anymore. I was maybe getting 15 minutes of sleep a night. Or not. I was fully experiencing insomnia. The body was so exhausted. But yet at the same time, I couldn't turn the mind off or the body, the state that it was in, to allow it to enter into rest. It simply wouldn't stop. It simply wouldn't sleep. The panic attacks as a man were also something very difficult that I had to embrace. I held shame over the fact that I was experiencing panic attacks. I didn't know how to talk about them, what they necessarily even looked like, even though I was now experiencing them daily. I had never had panic attacks in my life before, but now in this moment, they were a part of my everyday journey. I knew at that point, following being charged by a supervisor, that was the end of the road for me. I no longer held choice. I had to step forward. I had never done this in my life, had to step forward on someone who was in such a space. So I first sought out some advice from a few close peers. And what I was met with was the resounding idea of be very careful about how you step forward and make claim to experiencing harassment and bullying. There was an immense amount of fear from those that I spoke to. As I reached out to a few peers to discuss my situation, it became very clear that a very resounding amount of members were very fearful themselves to step forward about harassment or bullying claims. The advice I got was actually filled with hesitation, and it wasn't totally supported in that moment. Fearful of the impact to our careers is very much a thing that we hold within. This belief of stepping forward in regards to harassment and bullying can actually be viewed by many as ineffective as well. And a lot of times, harassment and bullying isn't truly honored in the workplace. The process is incredibly daunting and frustrating and slow. It often at times doesn't promote resolution or healing. But being where I was, I knew that was not an option. I had to go forward. And I did just that. The day after I had experienced this episode of being charged, I walked down to the harassment and bullying unit. I asked to speak to someone in the unit about something that I had experienced, and I was given somebody who made time for me and sat down with me. She held compassion in that meeting. She held empathy and sympathy for what I had been through, and I will be grateful to her for that. I think that is an incredibly important part of this process. What became very apparent, though, was that the length of time that it was going to take to deal with this if I officially decided to step forward and lay a formal harassment complaint was that the investigation itself could take upwards of 1 year. I had hit my first roadblock in the harassment and bullying process. I know looking back now that this is not the way things should be handled. Support needs to be given, and it needs to happen swiftly. If complaints are coming in, people need to be removed from those teams in order to foster a healthy working environment, or at least allowed an opportunity for people to start their own journey into healing. But having had been told this then, back in 2015, I knew that the only choice that I had, which was to lay a complaint, was not going to go anywhere. I told that investigator in that moment that this was no longer an option for me, that I didn't have a year to wait on the team for them to take action and to complete their investigation. So I let them know that I needed to explore other options. Upon leaving the harassment and bullying unit, I was completely confused. I was in no man's land. Having an organization that is there to support you didn't exist for me. Having an outlet to take your complaint to have actioned, did not exist for me. Feeling completely unsupported and alone in this process, I returned to my desk completely defeated, consumed by another panic attack. I knew in that moment, though, I couldn't sit in that space and allow those feelings to continue to rage on. That something must be done. It had to. There had to be hope somewhere. The last place that I could turn to was that bully's boss. And I knew I had to take that step, despite how difficult that also was. I met with that bully's boss, and I had a very candid conversation, a very open conversation. I was incredibly overwhelmed, stuttering on my words, sweating profusely. I could barely choke out a sentence, but he listened, and he too showed compassion, and I will be forever grateful for that. I spoke for quite some time about the entire incident, everything that had happened. and how I believed that this person was actually suffering in active addiction from alcohol consumption and needed professional help, that he no longer was able to lead. I had brought up the 2 incidents where 2 members, including myself, had been physically charged by him. During the entire time while I sat and told my truth, I felt like the world's worst person, still in somewhat of a state of disbelief of, did this really happen to me? Could it have been this bad? At times we have a hard time accepting the reality that comes from the pain from harassment and bullying. And in the bid to deal with that pain, it's almost like we try to build a false reality around ourselves, to numb this pain out, to suppress it, to say it doesn't exist or it didn't happen. I was caught in between 2 worlds as I spoke. But on this incident, I chose to embrace my pain and tell my story despite the way I felt in that very moment. I tried my best to meet this meeting with compassion and respect for this individual, an understanding of where he was, the pain that he held. And despite everything that had been created by him, my main concern revolved around the fact that this person needs help. He needs to be sent to rehab. That was my focus in that meeting, but at the same time, I now was not focusing on my own pain anymore as I started to look for a solution to deal with this issue, so I no longer had to work under him. I couldn't continue on this path. I guess a part of me recognized, or at least felt, that it was more honorable to honor this person in their pain and get them the help they need. I should have also been focused on my own pain at the same time and ask for help with that as well. The working environment that was no longer supportive, the one that had caused these panic attacks to start to happen. I didn't make mention of that at that moment. I wish I would have. This supervisor met me with, again, compassion and recognized quickly that something very real was going on. I believe he too had his own observations into this problem that was brewing. And now he could not sit still and ignore it anymore. He told me in that meeting, "Thank you for stepping forward. We do have to do our own investigation to make sure that our ducks are in a row, but we will let you know as soon as we know something about where we are going next." Following that meeting, I returned to work, trying to hide the fact that I had just had this secretive meeting about my boss, who is still there as my boss, trying now not to show any kind of indication of what I just had to do to tip him off. He was a smart individual. I'll give him that. I put my head down and I continued to work, and I drew no attention to myself whatsoever. I flew under the radar. Now, for quite some time, there was complete silence around this issue. There was no movement, not a whisper of what was happening behind the scenes. I continued to come in to work, complete my shift, and go home for days on end, weeks on end. Those weeks eventually turned into months. I was becoming frustrated at that point, thinking, why is this taking so long? My panic attacks had increasingly started to grow now, to a point where I would shake at my desk from an overwhelming amount of anxiety. I would often get tunnel vision and lose that ability to have peripheral vision as things closed in. My body, in an effort to deal with the anxiety because I wasn't doing it, began to sweat through my hands. At times they were dripping. That's another common response for the body in order to deal with anxiety. Your hands will sweat. It's a very normal thing. My breathing would often change as well. It would become much more shallow, much more short. And that's also a common effect of heightened anxiety or fight or flight response. Our breathing changes. I would often catch myself in these moments and have to remind myself, take a deep breath, Nate, slow down, reconnect. My body was in this state for months on end while I waited with no word. Looking back now, more should have been done. This should have been handled much, much differently. Things should have moved much quicker. I could or should have went home to decompress, to allow myself to have an environment at home where I could actually allow the body to rest. Again, I don't blame the RCMP or myself, but these things do need to happen when you step forward. Potentially, for yourself, you need to know where you're at and what you need. Allowing yourself to ignore the problem isn't a solution. To continue to try to rage on and work within the RCMP and provide excellent results. We are allowed to ask for these things, for help, and I should have done just that. The amount of time the investigation took also should have sped up significantly, or at least the managers in that moment, once a complaint comes in, they could look at removing that supervisor temporarily, sending him home to begin his own journey so that the impact, the devastation that was being caused, can be paused and stopped in that moment. Instead, it was almost like the world was pretending to be normal and life carried on as normal. But there was a very real impact to me. At one point, I was away for training or something. I wasn't at work. But this was the moment where the managers had stepped forward and spoke with this bully. There was no more hiding from this. And support was given to get professional help, as it should be. That person was finally removed from the team and told to go home. Now, why did this happen while I was gone? I don't know. I wasn't there for that. And maybe that was the best case scenario. I don't know why this happened then. I can only assume that it happened that way because the managers were actually trying to look out for me. When I returned to work, I had learned about everything that had happened and I felt complete relief. Like finally what I had experienced had been validated through the actions of management. That what I had experienced was finally acknowledged and that this problem was gone. I felt like in that moment that it was finally done and I could move on. What I didn't recognize though, that these panic attacks weren't going away on their own. The heightened anxiety was still there. There was no real follow-up conversation that ever really took place from that complaint. Now, in belief that the problem was gone, I essentially moved on. I didn't have any intention or desire to go back down to the harassment unit and let them know as to what had happened and that a formal investigation should be launched into this individual. Is that something I may have and should have considered? Considering the devastating impact and wake that this member had on people? Absolutely, this wasn't a one-time incident. But alas, in that moment, I was just relieved to move on, to be able to try and heal. And I did just that. That team continued on without leadership for some time. We were all strong members. We didn't necessarily need it. And we were checking in with chain of command often anyways. But over time, our team actually did get collapsed. And most of us went back out to different teams to supplement them. That transition for me happened around 2016. And I went back to an investigative body on the Federal Serious Organized Crime Group with hopes of being able to continue on and to continue on performing the way I was previously. The only problem with that is I didn't actually truly heal from that moment that happened to me. Once on this new team, the panic attacks continued to occur. And they continued to occur almost daily for nearly a year. During that time, I definitely struggled while I was at work. I was having to start to say no to certain things, which was unlike me. I wasn't able to take on as much. And I know for a fact that my performance had actually started to slide. I was getting overwhelmed very easily, was irritable at times. I struggled to connect with others while I was on that team. I most likely in moments lacked compassion myself and empathy. I couldn't. I simply couldn't. My sleep continued to deteriorate or at least hold a plateaued level of insomnia. I was not well. I was not well, but I had no idea where to turn to ask for help. At one point, I knew I couldn't hide forever and that most likely someone would eventually start to see some of my struggles. So in an effort to address something along the way, I met with one of my new supervisors who openly had post-traumatic stress. And I knew he understood what we go through. And I told him that I needed his support to step forward and talk to my sergeant at the time and let him know that I was struggling and that I needed some form of support on that team. And we did just that. We met with that sergeant. And I openly acknowledged that I had been struggling on the team and that it was my belief that I needed to step back in some of the things that I was doing at work, some of the roles. I needed less stress. I was too overwhelmed on the daily. Now, what I can say, again, I was met with compassion. This individual didn't understand PTSD, but he did understand that what I was telling him was very real for me, and he gave me his support. So for the rest of that year, I tried to hold myself together the best that I could. I guess for me in that moment in 2016, that was roughly the beginning of the end. Despite my struggles, the impact that this had had on my body up to that point was very significant. It was profound. The PTSD was deeply entrenched. I still was seeing a psychologist at least once a month. Still was talking, still was learning. Still using some of those healthy coping mechanisms. But nothing was working. even the medication. During that same time, too, my wife and I had become pregnant. We were completely elated. We were filled with joy. We would be starting our family. That same year in 2016, we ended up getting married. Despite the pain and suffering that was happening to me at work, my personal life was still advancing. And in 2017, we would welcome my daughter Lila to the world. At that same time, I knew I was completely burnt out, and that taking paternity leave was a very real option for me, something that I needed to have time away from work in order to rest and to try and heal. So I did just that. And it was one of the most beautiful experiences I've ever had in my life, to be there for my child from the beginning, every single day, to feed them, to change them, to connect with them, to offer them comfort when they hurt. Having children is an incredibly beautiful journey in life, one that causes you to grow, no matter what your approach is to parenting. But despite some of the beauty that was happening away from work, the panic attacks continued, and the stress continued. And despite the slower days of being a parent now, I still struggled. Those didn't just vanish. I look forward to connecting with you next week and continuing to share the next part of my journey in my life and what that looked like. Thank you for tuning in and supporting. I truly appreciate it. Take care and much love. I hope you enjoyed this last episode. As we continue to grow, I would appreciate your support. Please consider subscribing to the podcast on your favorite streaming platform. Leave a comment or a review and share this with anyone that you may know may benefit from what we are discussing. Have a great week, and as always, thank you for tuning in.